Hi, everyone. I'm Julie Balderrama, and I am doing a series of interviews with people because I want to write a book, which I'm super excited about. I've gone through many titles of the book, but for now, we'll call it the Book of Self-Love. And for me, self-love includes a lot of different aspects of self-care, of understanding who we are at our core. And one of the things that I definitely want to explore in the book is the shadow. And the perfect person to explore the shadow with is my dear friend, Christelle Arcucci. So I want to just let her introduce herself, and then we will get started talking about the shadow.
Thank you so much for inviting me here. I'm delighted to have this conversation with you, Julie. And this shadow work is getting more and more powerful in my life, in my business. My focus in my business is called the Soul Purpose Network. And the focus is to transform our core wounds into our soul purpose superpowers. So for me, there is so much power tied up in the parts of ourselves or our past, our wounding, our blocks, our limiting beliefs, our, the contracts and agreements that we've made in this life or past lives. So the focus of my work is supporting us in turning towards those things, facing those things, and tapping into the power that lives there. So I'm delighted to be having this conversation with you today.
Yeah, that's so, I love that message of, we've sort of like been packing our bags and carrying our baggage along with us throughout this journey, and seeing it as baggage, seeing it as something that weighs us down, as something that gets in our way, as obstacles or resistance. And, every once in a while we unpack that bag and we look at everything again, and then we pack it back and then we keep carrying it. And I love the idea that we can actually unpack the bag and through a process of reintegration begin to see those things that were wounds or traumas in our lives as a learning experience at the very least, but really as an empowering practice of reclaiming our whole self. I love that. That's speaking my language.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm super excited to have this conversation because I'm a shadow freak too. I love working with the shadow. And, I don't know if you have this experience, but it is, when I say that to people, it's a little sometimes off-putting, right? Like, what are you going to do? Are you evil? Are you a bad witch? So I just wanted to start off our conversation with a discussion about the shadow and why we're super excited to work with the shadow. So I'm going to let you take it away and your understanding of the shadow and how you work with it.
Yes, well, one of the things I want to mix into our cauldron today, although people are going to be watching this interview later, one of the cool things about the timing of this is we're right in between two eclipses,
right,
which is our experience on Earth of, the shadow of just the moon covering the sun for the, which way was it? Anyway, there was the lunar eclipse just, and then we're coming towards the solar eclipse. So that in itself, so that to me helps people open the door to, okay, shadow doesn't have to be this, oh, you're practicing black magic, or voodoo dolls, or these things where they are doing harm. So from my perspective,
and even more subtly, I think if we don't go all the way to that extreme, it's this idea of like we shun negative emotions or negative thoughts or things like that. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Sorry, go ahead, please.
Yes. So yeah, that's the extreme of it when people have this, fear response to shadow work being destructive, which from my perspective, it's the opposite. The shadow, the reality of being human is, the most basic example is we all face death in our lives. Animals that we love, people that we love, our own mortality. So to me, turning towards death is like one piece of shadow work that is so obvious, yet there's very little, especially in our culture, there's very little time and attention given to handling it gracefully. In the grief that comes from losing someone, or the psychology that it takes to turn towards our own death, or someone dying. So that to me is one example of shadow work that's not so obscure, and that's one piece of shadow work, and there's a lot of it. And to me, that shadow work is turning towards our challenging emotions, our past traumas, our wounds, and finding the power there. Not living in the trauma, because I think we can go back and reframe and shift how we feel about traumatic experiences. But it's when we push things away that they gain power over us, and they come out in subconscious and unconscious ways, which is part of, for me, the purpose of shadow work is turning towards the power that's available so that we can use it consciously, instead of it coming out like in passive aggressive behavior towards my partner, or, all of the other infinite ways that people act out in the world. That to me, our current government is a great example of the shadow, and all of these things just that are mind-blowing happening on the public stage and in the global political situation. And to me, that's because of the suppressed shadow, that now it's all coming out. And there's you can only suppress it for so long before the big monster, Pandora's box.
Yeah. I love that you brought up that our current sort of cultural, political world, and I think it's much, much bigger than the US, obviously, but we're kind of we live here, so of course,
yes. So it impacts us more.
It impacts us, and it's sort of central to what we're experiencing. And I know that it's super easy, especially in our culture, to get into a space of right or wrong, good or bad, positive and negative, and to really put value on one or the other. And so I think that a lot of our tensions and a lot of our conflict comes from the belief that one of us has to be right and one of us has to be wrong. And I know you had a conversation with someone a couple days ago where you were navigating conflict. You did a video where you were navigating conflict, and you were showing in real time how to do that. And I love the rule or the agreement that you proposed with him, which was, could we be in conversation together where there is no right and wrong? I'm not right or wrong, and you're not right or wrong. And I think, right there, holy cow, changes and shifts the dynamics and makes it a container where we're available, we're open to getting out of our beliefs.
Yeah, and that's really threatening to some people.
Mm-hmm.
Because I think that's a common paradigm of conflict, is we have to figure out, like, if you and I were in conflict, the point of resolution is for me to win, and I'm right and you're wrong. So just that in itself is like letting go of that power struggle of being like, your perspective of this conversation and your experience of this conversation is radically different than mine. And so can we be in that? Can we be in that space of, in that conversation ended that we agreed to disagree. And again, that's another level for people that is like, they can't do that, right? Like agreeing to disagree, like, no, I have to be right. You have to agree with me.
Right. A draw is not a win.
Yes. And for me, it's so interesting to be in conversations with people that are like, we have to agree. And for me, it's like, I got issues, but that's not one of them for me. So, I'm perfectly fine agreeing to disagree. And, that's another example of turning towards the things that make us so uncomfortable. And I would say, on the most basic level, shadow work is turning towards what makes us uncomfortable.
Mm-hmm.
Uncomfortable emotions, uncomfortable experiences in our past, uncomfortable conversations. So, and it takes incredible courage. It takes an incredibly courageous heart and a vulnerability to turn towards what we feel uncomfortable with. And then there are those of us that are completely hooked.
Shadow addict. Yep, me too.
Transformation junkie. Sign
Yep,
me up.
totally. So, we talked for a little bit before we got on and started recording, and we had a conversation about how these outer relationship dynamics are really just sort of our, like Shakespeare said, all the world's a stage. So these outer relationship dynamics, power dynamics, are really just our inner world sort of being played out in front of us, so we can kind of question and get curious, if we choose, and do a little bit of investigation. So if we take that same idea that we're turning toward what makes us uncomfortable in external situations, this is where I geek out, is the turning toward the internal stuff too. So that the parts of me, like if I were to, my external world were to sort of cast my play, what parts of me are uncomfortable for me. And I think I may have to get up on my soapbox for a little while. I think that this whole trend of only thinking positive thoughts and only recognizing positive emotions or turning toward positive emotions and doing whatever we can to get as quickly away from the uncomfortable parts. And that's a way to rephrase, right? Instead of saying the negative parts or the negative feelings or the negative emotions, I say uncomfortable. That's another way of saying, yes, you're uncomfortable, but you're welcome here.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think, the fastest way to say what you're talking about is spiritual bypass. Like, let's just call it what it is. Yeah. And that's very common in the spiritual communities and in, the love and light communities. It's just like, oh no, it's only about, being good and being right and being in the light. And from my perspective, that is not possible in the human realm, right? In other realms of reality, okay, maybe we're all just walking around on clouds and all is well, and the chimes are playing and the harps and the angels and all this. But on this plane of reality, there's a lot of hard stuff that happens. There are horrible things happening all over the world right now. And so there is a reality of challenge in the human realm. So, one distinction I do want to make is that I think that often people in the beginning of their exploration of shadow work is that they then assume that abuse is okay. Right. And I just want to mix that in, that there's a difference between turning towards the shadow, if you're having a conflict with your partner, turning towards what makes you uncomfortable, and then letting someone have bad behavior towards you that is abusive. So I just want to say, like, embracing the shadow is nothing to do with abuse. It has to do with healing abuse, right? If abuse or trauma has happened in the past, like, let's go back and mine that and do healing work around it and turn towards the shadow. But shadow work is by no means an excuse for bad abusive behavior.
I completely agree. And I would even argue further that true shadow work helps you occupy the space where very, very quickly what bad behavior is not okay with you. What types of behavior is not okay with you, and are able to really own that. I know that I've definitely gone through a process in my life where I'm, because of my childhood wounds and traumas and things like that, where I'm beginning to understand what's okay and what's not okay, and then express what's okay and what's not okay and I don't need to do it. Like, I think we get into this space where we feel like we have to do it in this very like Kali Ma sort of way, which sometimes we do, but not always. Like, it can just be, that's not okay.
Yes. Yeah. And I think for most women, simply finding their no is the beginning of
Yeah.
their path of shadow work, because most of us have been trained by our families, by culture, by school, to be good girls and to be pleasing. And so for most women, simply finding their no is going to be wildly uncomfortable.
Yeah.
So, and it's so important in the healing process.
Yes. Yeah.
So that's one way of, someone who, again, is new to shadow work, like simply feeling that in your body, like to imagine a situation where you say yes when what you really mean is no, and imagine what it would be like to say no. And then imagine what it would be like to be like, no.
Yeah. And being able to be with the discomfort of that, because it's not comfortable. I remember a friend of mine telling me a story about when she said no in that way, like she knew that she would normally say yes in this situation, and she chose to say no instead. And she called me and she was like, oh my God, I have to eat all the chocolate ever just to sort of like self-soothe, like to come out of that place of that was extremely uncomfortable for her and empowering for her.
Yes. And for me, when I found my no, then that became my go-to. So then it's like, then for me, it was just like, no, like that was,
yes, I know this word. I know it.
But then it was like, for me, then it was like giving myself time, because that was part of my healing journey, was just finding the no of immediate stop. So then for me, it was like, okay, in situations where I'm safe to pause, right? And to feel in, is it a no, or is it a negotiation? Because sometimes there's part of a yes, right? It's like yes to this part, but not this.
Right.
So then, also knowing that our no can be I'm not willing to, wear pink polka dots, but I'm happy to wear purple polka dots.
Right. Right. Exactly. Yeah. This could just go in so many different directions. But my intention with this video was really to sort of, and maybe we just talk about this over and over and over again and get deeper and deeper. But my intention was to sort of have just kind of an introduction to shadow work with this particular interview. So I want to talk to you about some of the experiences that you've had in doing shadow work, and if you could share, a story or so about a part that you've reintegrated. So I didn't really mention this, but I work with different parts of ourselves. Carolyn Myss talks about archetypes. There's internal family systems. There's all kinds of different paradigms to work with inner parts. And I think the thing that we're most familiar with is our inner child. But there are lots of parts running around, right? So I'm curious if you would be willing to share a story about a part that you've reintegrated back into the whole.
Yeah. So at the beginning of my journey of doing shadow work, one of the first shadow aspects was working with the inner critic. And, you can call it, whatever names. His name is Zoltar. And he looks like Zorro, right? He's got the hat and the mask, and he carries a sword, and he has the boots. And, for me, I'm just very visual in that way. And
right.
When I started working with him, I feel his presence, and he's still with me, which I'll get to that in a minute. But the inner critic was one of the first things that I turned towards. And I was like, all right, we gotta work this out, because when the inner critic was bashing my head in, it was difficult to function. So
going back to that, abuse is not okay, right?
Exactly. And it was like, all right, so this is not working. So what else is possible? So a story of that, how did this play out? So part of it is, recognizing that those parts of us, this part for me is a protector. And so he's trying to protect me. He would show up when I was running yoga teacher trainings at the time, and he would show up and tell me how horrible of a teacher I was and how horrible of a yoga teacher trainer I was. And so one example of this is I was in Taiwan running a yoga teacher training, and we were in a room that had like 3-story ceilings. And I'm very, my inner vision is very strong. And this particular moment, I mean, I'd been working with the inner critic for many years already at this point, and it healed a lot of it. But this particular moment, I was teaching and the inner critic showed up and just started smashing my head. And it made it difficult to function. I mean, most of the time it's like, wah, 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 this voice in my head. But this particular moment, it was like a cartoon. You know, I am life size, and it's like he keeps getting bigger and bigger and just like has a hammer and is smashing my head. And then all of a sudden he's literally like 3 stories high. And I am leading the posture part. So it's very like I have to be paying attention and walking around and engaging students, like clear that I can't keep doing this. I'm like, all right, change the dynamics. I bring everyone into a meditation where it's like the room is quieter and my need to be really actively engaged is much less. And so then I get them there. I was like, hang on a second.
I'll be with you in a minute.
Pause. I'll be with you in a moment. So I change gears of the room. I get them into their practice. And then I turn towards the inner critic and I'm like, what? And that was it. No resistance. No, leave me alone. You don't understand. I'm doing the best I can, you know, which are the common arguments when our inner critic is putting us down, as we defend. So instead, I just turned towards the inner critic, and it was like somebody, you know, pulled the plug, and then all of a sudden the inner critic is like, and it's life size, standing next to me and speaking to me about the ways in which I could be a better yoga teacher trainer. And everything he shared was solid. Like everything was true. But when I was busy defending myself, he got louder and meaner and more intense to get my attention. But the moment I just turned towards him, it was like, what do you have to tell me? You know, it's like a kid, you know, these inner parts of ourselves, the shadow parts, it's like, it's just going to scream louder. Like if you ignore a child that's having a temper tantrum, like a lot of the time, the best thing you can do is to be like, what do you need?
And we don't get asked that question a lot, and we don't ask ourselves that question. What do you need? What needs are not being met right now?
Yes.
Because we are busy defending, we're busy being right. Yeah, I love that. And what it reminds me of is dream work. So when I get asked this question all the time, you know, what does a nightmare mean, or recurring dreams? Well, there's something larger than life that's been trying to get your attention for a while, that you've been not turning towards, that you've been defending against. And so that bear's going to chase you until you turn toward it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I love that story. It's such a great example of how we think it's going to be so much worse than it actually is.
Right. And part of why that worked that way is because I had learned to recognize that part of me as an ally. You know, so in that moment, it was like, okay, I'm not listening. And that's why I knew to change gear, you know, because I had done that before. And for whatever reason in that situation, I was, you know, it's kind of like, hey, could you come back later? I'm busy. And it was like, no, but and part of it was I could hear it, you know, because when we have childhood wounding of not being good enough, any feedback is a threat. Right. So at that point, I had done enough healing to have him say things that I could do better, and to say, you're right. You know, that is true. If I did those things, I would be a more effective teacher trainer, instead of that being threatening as well.
Right. And so when the healing that you had done prior to that, do you remember your first sort of step with the inner critic?
The first step, well, I've been doing this work for a really long time. But part of it, you know, part of my inner critic, which is common for a lot of people, was because of my relationship with my father when I was very young. He was really intense on me as a young athlete and wasn't supportive. And that was, in my very early years. And so part of the healing started from a real live relationship because, my father was an alcoholic when I was very young, and he got sober when I was about 11. And then he became an ally. So, and he became my greatest fan and greatest supporter. So that for me was a real live shift, because the voice in my head, the inner critic, was programmed from what my father was saying to me. So for me, that's what started it. And, my father at that time, after he got sober, he, supported me in getting a therapist, and he started doing all this inner child work. So for me, this started in my early, I was 11. So, that was real life, right? Like that was my father introducing me to this whole world of the wounded inner child and these different parts that exist within ourselves, and like that.
Yeah, what I love about that is again, we're going back to that mirror of the external world as mirroring the internal world. And so oftentimes we can have these experiences in our external world, and you were very lucky to have an experience where external relationship shifted. And so I just want to point out that, I think a lot of us feel like our relationships are sort of fixed. My relationship with my mom is fixed. It's never going to change. That's just who she is. That's just who I am. We don't get along. Or, whatever story it is in our head. And it is quite possible for our relationships to shift, even dramatically, from someone who is very critical to someone who's your greatest ally. It's not just that you shifted from him being critical of you to you like sort of just accepting each other, but he actually became your ally.
Right. And to say for people that aren't that lucky, that's not the only way, right? Like with my mother, I've been estranged from my mother since that time. And so all of the healing work I do now around my mother, she's not involved in.
Right.
So, so I have both experiences of a real live relationship shifting and him becoming an ally. And then still to this day, it's been decades since I've been estranged from my mother and decades since I've seen her. And that I'm still working with that shadow and that wounding. And, so we don't need the people that we have conflicts with to be engaged in our own healing and our own shadow work. It helps when they are, but it's not necessary.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah, I love that sort of map of going from a part of ourselves, going back to the internal now, a part of ourselves that is not functioning in a way that feels comfortable to us, to becoming an ally. So again, rather than saying to the inner critic, just shut up, go away, I hate you, you don't have any room here anymore. How can I make this part an ally? Because I'm a huge underdog rooter. I root for the underdog all the time. And everybody's been dogging on fear. And I'm going to do a video about fear today, as a matter of fact, because I do feel like fear gets that bad rap. And I think fear can be an ally, and can reveal a lot of different parts of ourselves that are available for being allies. Yeah, I love that map from...
Yes. And I agree about fear. Fear is, the feeling of fear is energy. So, the number one way to transform our feeling of fear is to stop making it bad or wrong.
Right.
And being like, you shouldn't be what you are. It's like, how would you feel if someone said that to you? You
totally.
would be like, oh, really?
I'll show you.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, turning towards the fear and noticing that we're feeling fear and being willing to turn towards it and embrace it for what it is.
And I love what you said, the pause, right? Because we, even in our interactions with people, we're so quick to we're almost really just waiting for you to stop talking so I can start talking, so we don't have that pause of, how do I want to respond here?
Yes.
It's a beautiful example. It's a pause.
Yes. And letting there be that,
Right.
like letting there be that place of stillness and connection and no words is something that, and to me, this brings in a piece of our cultural fear of embodiment. Julie and I can be together with words, but if we were sitting next to each other and not talking, it would be weird. Why? Why is it weird? But I think it's partly just because we don't have as much experience of being with other people and not talking. And just being together and being in our bodies and noticing our sensations. Like last night I was at a birthday party, and at the end of the evening, there was just this huge cuddle puddle on the couch that was so delicious. And so much of the time, nobody was talking. And it was so delicious to my system. It was just like, oh my gosh, all of these people that I love and think are amazing. And we're all connected. Even the person that's on the far end, we're connected through touch, through this web of human connection, which is so beautiful and so missing from so many people's lives. I was just talking to one of my friends who is a man who works in corporate America. He's single, and he will go weeks without getting a hug. Right? Handshakes, okay.
Yeah.
And it's more difficult for men, in my opinion, to
Absolutely.
have touch and embodiment that is, just platonic, healthy affection. So I think that piece of being in our own bodies, feeling uncomfortable emotions, and also having safe people that we can practice with is, eye gazing for some people is going to be a shadow practice, right? Because they're going to be like, oh, I have to smile, I have to say something, it's like, and that, I think that in itself is a practice that can help people in their fear response. Right? It's just simply eye gazing with another person. Some people it's going to be more comfortable than other. I'm super comfortable with eye contact. Other people that's going to be an edgy practice of being seen.
You've set me up beautifully for the next question, so I want to thank you for that.
Absolutely.
I am curious, and you've already sort of intimated some tools that you have, but I'm curious what your tools are for doing shadow work. And I know you're an improviser too, and you kind of just go with what works and listen to your intuition. But if you've got any tools in your toolbox or magic tricks in your magic backpack, I would love if you would share, especially if you have anything that it's embodied like that, the eye gazing.
Right. Yes. Well, I have so many. So what is, so one of the first thing that comes to mind that for me is very present in my life is what I call working in the death field. And that is because both my older sister and my father have passed away. So they have died. So around those dates of their passing, as well as their, primarily around their passing, I take time to go into the death field. And what does that mean?
Yeah.
So to me, that is being with that experience of them no longer being embodied and turning towards the fact that their physical body and being is gone, and physically creating a sacred space for that. So like one of the tools that I got this year, so my older sister passed away 22 years ago this June, and so I bought this little crystal skull.
Yeah.
Which, for some people could be a really taboo, evil object. And I work with crystals a lot in my business. Like there's crystals all over my desk. So they are, so that's one way of an embodied practice of, with this, I bought it this June because I am 44. My sister died 22 years ago. So I wanted to add another component to my practice of turning towards her passing, turning towards the experience of her death and her loss, and giving myself space and time to grieve. So for me, that practice of being in the death field is simply space and time to not get out of bed, to cry all day, to pound pillows, to sit in meditation, to channel her, to, whatever that shows up as, because I do, any one of those practices, I've been doing this for a long time, so I do have a lot of tools. But there's also being with the sensations in my body. So part of being in the death field is like, can look like a dance, where I feel the sensations in my body and follow them. And so I may collapse on the floor and be sobbing. So it's like embodying the emotions that I'm feeling in that process and not resisting, like, I'm fine.
Right.
It's feeling like right now as I'm talking, I feel this heaviness on the back of my neck. So it could be like the surrendering to it and soothing myself in that, or feeling this heaviness in my gut, or, and so actually embodying those, turning towards those, moving towards those sensations that are happening in my body when I enter the death field. And that's particularly on the day my sister died, and she was dying for a few days. So for that, there's kind of a window of time that I give myself time and space for that. So, so that's more the embodied practice. Then of course there's journaling. I do spoken word. So I will do that. I will take an audio recorder and allow myself to just channel and speak. And I could go on, but I'm going to let you ask or run with that.
I love so we're on the same page with this, that energy is everything. There's energy in everything. And so there's emotions are energy. And so embodying them in that way and allowing your body to sort of follow that energy, I think, is a wonderful way to allow those emotions to flow. Because when we plaster on the smile and we say we're fine, they get stuck. And I think that's where the real suffering comes. Being in the death field is probably not something that you would label as comfortable necessarily, although you've probably gotten a degree of comfort.
Right. Well, after 22 years of practice.
Yeah. I would hope so. But at the same time,
I would say it's willingness. So I do want to clarify, because often people think, oh, well, you're comfortable with all this stuff. I'm like, no, I'm just willing to feel uncomfortable.
Right.
I'm not resisting the fact that it's going to feel like hell.
Right. Right. One of the things, I know that you, were at one point a yoga teacher. And so for me, practices like yoga are an embodied way for me to practice being comfortable with being uncomfortable in discomfort. And again, like, I want to go back to what you're saying about abuse is not okay. Pain is not okay. We don't want to be in a yoga pose and be in pain. That's our cue to get out or to adjust or modify in some way. But there are going to be some poses that are uncomfortable, that are something that if we can hang with for a little while, stay present with, we'll find that release. We'll find that energy starts to move. So for you, was yoga that practice of being more comfortable with discomfort, or was there something else, or just sort of it all happened at once?
Well, I was a gymnast, which to me, gymnastics is a very masochistic sport. Like, it hurts a lot, right? Like when the palm of my hands get ripped off and it's bleeding,
that hurts.
And I get back on the bars and swing on them, when the bruises on my hips. So I feel like I was trained as a gymnast to be okay with physical discomfort. So for me, it was actually the opposite, where I was like, too comfortable, hurting myself. And I mean that in the context of gymnastics, where it's like we're physically training in ways that hurt,
right?
Or pushing our body to the limit. So for me, when I found yoga, it was the opposite. It was like, oh, I can be moving my body in ways that are powerful and physical, and I can be listening and adjusting so that it feels good. So, and that's, I would imagine most people are going to go into it the opposite way, like you were saying. But that was my experience, is going from a sport that was super brutal and intense on my body to learning to play at the edges, to not just push to get my body to do this pose. It was like, how can I support my body in unfolding into the pose, as working at the edges of where it wants to open, and being and breathing there until there's more opening. And I think that's the more common experience for people, is like, go to the edge of discomfort and be there, breathe there, where you can still breathe. Because of course, when somebody pushes too far in a yoga pose, I think this is true emotionally, you know, we go into a freeze response, which is a stress response, right? As we stop breathing. And that's generally not going to help energy to move. So working with the yoga pose, or working with our emotions in a way that we can still stay present, we can still feel, we can still pay attention to sensations. And there was one other thing I wanted to say in there, and I think it's gone.
Okay. Well, if it comes back, let me know. Before we move on to the next question, I just want to identify something really beautiful, that a theme that's sort of been coming up, and that is the pause and space and time. And, that, to me, that is like, that's shadow. And we, again, with our discomfort with not talking, stillness, not being busy, we have a tendency to do a lot, and to fill up our calendars, and when that gets to be too much, we tune out with television, shopping, alcohol, drugs, sex, whatever it is that our drug of choice, spirituality. Transformation. I don't want to turn towards that. I'm going to turn towards this instead. But it's that really beautiful place of mystery where we just let it all be, whatever it is, and we don't try to figure it out, and we don't try to fix it and transform it. It just gets to be. And that place is quite uncomfortable for.
Yeah. And I think coming back to the inner child, that's generally the easiest access point for people to start with when I work with clients, is working with their inner child, because everyone I've ever met and worked with has some shadow stuff from their childhood. Even if they had a happy upbringing, there's still unmet needs. And, growing up in our, I think often in our culture, the way that children are born is trauma, unfortunately. But so it's like everyone has some shadow work, and working simply with the inner child is often the easiest place for people to start, in being like, what would I say this to a child? And that being a place for people to start is working with their inner child. And especially if they have a child, right? It's like, would I ever say that to a child? And most of the time the answer is no. Right. So then it's like learning to speak to our own inner wounded child in a way that is creating that reparenting, that healing of, it's okay that you're afraid or angry or frustrated or whatever. Like, there is space and time for you, and I'm here, and how can I support you, and what do you need? So I think that's an important piece of it. And then there's, of course, always containers. I think as adults, there is we need to give time and space to our inner child, but then don't let the inner child run your business. Right? Like, you've got to have the grown-up that's like, right, okay, honey, I'm sorry that you don't want to go to work right now, but I have to work, so you're going to need to whatever. It's like, there's that process of, paying attention to the inner child, but then also we are in grown women bodies. So we also need to recognize that the inner child doesn't get to run the show, and but the more that we can create those clear containers for time and space to work with the inner child, or work with whatever shadow element we're working with, then it's like, okay, now we're done. And we're going back to whatever, paying bills or grocery shopping or whatever it is.
Right. I could go off on a whole thing that way too, but we're gonna, in the interest of time. So what's present for you right now as far as shadow work is concerned? What are you currently working with?
Yes. Well, I'm working on this project called The Forbidden Phoenix.
Right.
So, which is very much about transformational life events and traumas that women have experienced and the power of that. You know, the phoenix literally gets burned to the ground before the new one gets born, which in itself is a terrifying experience. And for any woman who's been through one of those events, most of us have, some of us multiple times. So that's a current project that I'm working on. And in that, exploring a lot of challenging emotions. So, and having conversations with women about what, you know, because most often those life-changing events, whether it's death, divorce, their house burned down, you know, abuse, addiction, all of these challenging experiences, there's uncomfortable emotions that would be easy to be like, I don't want to touch that.
Right.
So going into these things, so part of that project, which here's my edge. So I'm going to share with you. Like, so there's the work that I do with clients.
Right.
And then there's the work that I'm personally doing, which
Right.
is generally, you know, I don't facilitate that work with clients until I've gotten to a point where I'm ready for that. But I recently did a photo shoot in my home by myself, and I embodied a shadow character, an archetype inside myself, because I'm working on this spoken word piece called Violated. So I embodied that and took photos, and it was really disturbing. Like when I looked at the photo, and it's funny because of course in doing my makeup, you know, for that and getting dressed, it's like I'm looking at myself in the mirror, but then looking at the photos, whoa. So, you know, talking about our shadow sides, our traumas, our wounds is one level, but then embodying it is like adding jet fuel.
It's wow. Because what is that story? There's some I don't even know it well enough to even paraphrase it. But there's power in stepping into the other person, and I know that we kind of have a watered down version of that when we think about, you know, walk in someone else's shoes for a while. But how many of us are willing to walk in a child molester's shoes? You know, how many of us are willing to walk in someone's shoes that we really consider to be quote unquote bad or evil or, you know, really that sort of scary, unwanted, shameful, whatever is present for you. That's, and then not only to just sort of like imagine it in your mind, but to like actually embody it. That's deep work.
It's really intense, and I wouldn't recommend it for beginners.
Yeah, that's not beginner work.
Don't try this at home,
Do
kids.
not try this at home.
Partly because, you know, first of all, the important thing in beginning shadow work is knowing how to self-regulate. You know, is like, because exploring the shadow side is most likely going to trigger past traumas. Mm-hmm. So it's important that we know how to, because shadow work without self-regulating is self-destructive. Right. So, you know, knowing how to self-regulate. And so for me, this playing this edge in my own personal practice, I have really well-developed self-regulating skills, like really exceptional, just because I've been doing healing work for most of my life, for decades, personally and professionally. So for me, that embodiment piece and looking at those pictures, they're you know, there's that point of choosing how much, right? It's like, how can we do this work in a way that's not destructive, in self-harm, but is an opening, because for me, it's this turning towards this experience of feeling violated, which I, from my experience and perspective of working with thousands of women, we've all felt violated, whether, we're not even talking about like rape or molestation. Like, yeah, there's lots of women that have had that experience, but as women, I think all of us have experienced feeling violated simply because we're a woman, somebody making a comment, or all these ways in which we get violated as women. So, turning towards that experience is part of that project, talking to women about their experiences and not trying to be like, okay, well, let's focus on the light. Okay. It's like, let's talk about it. What are the words that come to you? Where do you feel that in your body? How do you give that voice? Because for me, I do have background in embodiment and performance and public speaking, and this new piece of my work, which is the spoken word aspect of it, is newer, but it's channeling. And then when people hear it, it frees something up in them, simply hearing me and seeing me be in the embodiment of this experience. So for people watching this, it's knowing that where is the place to start. And shadow work does deconstruct, but it should not be destructive to your health. It should expand your health, but it's like a wound that's been infected. It's like the first thing, it's like you got to cut it open and get the like infection out. But then it's not like, you want to give time to clean that wound and tend to the wound. And
right.
So being wise about exploring shadow work and, making sure you're working with skillful practitioners and all that good stuff.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you brought that up. One of the sort of main tenets of the book that I'm writing is going to be about how self-care, which I think leads to self-regulation, it is the foundation. It's like the hub and the wheel. It's the thing that keeps you really grounded and able to discern, right? Is this in service to me? Is this expanding me, or is this destroying me? So I love that you brought that up, because we don't, pardon the pun, we don't want to go lightly into it. And then the other aspect that I love is, and I've got this aspect in my book as well, because I think it's important, and I know that we have this in common, and that is storytelling. Being able, I know Brene Brown says that shame cannot survive empathy. And so when we speak our truth, or we tell our story, it's so powerful, not just for the storyteller, but for the people who are listening, that can say, oh my gosh, I'm not alone.
Yes. Yeah.
I love that.
It is so powerful, that being able to, again, turn towards the challenging things that we have experienced. And, for me, in sharing this piece, Violated, it is partly because of so much healing work that I've done. So it's being able to know that this is in service to me. I mean, it is pushing my edge in embodying this and in putting it out there into the world. Yet for me, it's such an important part of supporting women and tapping into our power, right? It's like not just tapping into the power of the good girl, but also tapping into the fierce force of the feminine. Like there's fierce power within us. I mean, especially those of you who are moms, like giving birth, like the fierce feminine is like how that baby comes out. So it's needed, or, protecting your child, or these kinds of things, is like supporting women in embracing and loving that side of themselves as essential, right? Protecting not only our loved ones and our children, but also ourselves.
I think we're going to have to do another interview, or another about power in and of itself. Like, there's so much there. I was talking to a friend of mine, and she was saying, I think she read something or was listening to something about how, we want to stop labeling mean girls as mean girls, because mean girls are simply playing with power, and they're not being taught about power. They're just playing with power, and we make them part of the shadow, right? Like, it's bad to be a mean girl. But what's the opposite is to being a nice girl and being not empowered.
Right. Is being pleasing, and coming back to that thing we talked about at the beginning, is always giving your power away and not checking in to find our own no. So yeah, what would we call the mean girl instead? The powerful girl, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And yeah, we're going to have a whole other conversation.
She's like, don't drag me into that.
We can be talking for another hour about that. What do you have a sense of, like, what's waiting in the wings for you? I know that you are like totally willing to play your edge, and yet you're still in this journey. So there's got to be something waiting in the wings. Do you have a sense?
Of course. Well, especially with this Forbidden Phoenix project, you know, there's so much there, right? There is so much. And for me, that's part of the edge I'm playing in my own business, is being more vocal about shadow work being core part of my work. You know, so it's like that being talking about childhood woundings and past traumas and all of that. So, and one of the things I'm planning that feel, you know, beyond just the Forbidden Phoenix, the book, the podcast, the video series, is I'm planning an event. And so I haven't shared this with anybody. Oh my God.
Yay!
So, you're the first, right? And so part of it is, you know, also trying it on to see, you know, because again, there's the point of, like, I've been doing this work for a very long time, and I feel like this retreat is pushing my edge, which then is like other women not going to touch it. So my plan is bringing in this embodiment piece of embodying, dressing as an element of our shadow. And that being a key focus of the retreat. So here's the edgy part, is the name of the retreat. So, and I've played with this before, but calling it Seducing the Shadow.
I love it.
Oh, good. Because some people are like, you know, simply the word seducing is bad, which I don't have that framework. Like, yes, I mean, seduction can be used to manipulate, but I think seduction can also be incredibly sexy and erotic and wonderful.
Yeah, it can help us expand.
Yes.
And open up. Yeah. I love it. I mean, you know, I can totally see where people who are just at the beginning of their introduction into shadow work might still feel a little uncomfortable, but they're probably going to be uncomfortable with dressing up as the shadow anyway. So,
right. And just the concept of shadow work. So, where, you know, I mean, definitely adding seducing and shadow to the same sentence amplifies the intensity.
Oh, totally. But that'll bring the people that you want, you know? So I love the title. I think it's fantastic.
Yeah. And it's specifically being around women's sexuality, which I didn't already say, but that's part of why the seducing part is part of it, is like supporting women and turning towards their sexuality, their desires that they feel are taboo, forbidden, they're suppressing. So it's, you know, the focus of the retreat is around that, is turning towards our desires and turning towards the taboo desires and finding ways to express those in healthy ways, you know, because there are lots of ways to do that.
Yeah, I love it. I'm getting turned on just talking to you about it.
Woohoo!
Woo! So do you know when that retreat's going to be?
I don't have dates. I would like for it to be this autumn, but right now it's, you know, the first week of August. So my intention is this autumn, and we'll see how that. I will keep you posted.
Okay, sounds good. Yeah, I'm actually having a retreat myself this autumn. November. That's still autumn. Yeah, called the Wild Woman Retreat.
Nice.
And that retreat is really going to be about reclaiming that wild aspect of ourselves, that aspect of ourselves that hasn't been tamed. So there's a lot of different words for that, but I'm going to go with wild woman. And of course, embodiment's going to be absolutely central to it. So we're going to be dancing and we're going to be doing Qigong. I'm going to do a lot of dream work there because that floats my boat and gets me excited. So yeah, that's coming up for me, which I'm super excited about.
Awesome. I love it. And are you doing that near Austin?
I am. I'm doing it in Austin. It's at a retreat center called Alma de Mujer, and it's Indigenous women's. It's the part of the Indigenous Women's Network, and the retreat center is part of how they support Indigenous women. So the monies that they make when they have the retreat center open for things like this, they give some of those earnings to Indigenous women's groups. And the retreat center has had so many healers on it that you step onto the land and you're like buzzing just because of the people who have been there and the care that's taken with the land. And it's so beautiful.
Yes.
Yeah.
That sounds awesome. Hooray for liberating the wild woman. Woo!
Yes. Woo! We might do some howling at the moon. I think we planned it during the full moon. I'm pretty sure we did. Awesome. So we'll do some howling as well. So thank you so much, Christelle, for being here and talking about the shadow with me. And I would love to talk about power dynamics with you and other aspects that we sort of, the tangents, the roads we could have gone down but didn't. But I'm sincerely thankful for you today showing up and giving us your time and your energy and your resources. That's extremely valuable. Tell us where we can find you.
Yes, the easiest place to find me is sacredbodyrichlife.com.
Sweet. I like the name. Yeah.
Yes.
Sacredbodyrichlife.com. And I'll put that in comments and things like that as well. And then what about like social media? I know people like those sorts of things. So are you on Facebook? Are you on Instagram? Are you on Twitter?
Yes, all those places. Pinterest, YouTube. My website has all of that contact information, which is ChristelleArcucci.com, which nobody is going to spell right. But if you put it in the comments, that will help.
I will definitely do that. Excellent.
And that's where, all the links to my social media and current offerings and my blog and the podcast and all of that stuff are listed there.
Beautiful. And if you, and I'm speaking now to the people who are watching the recording, if you loved this video, and I really hope that you did, we would both appreciate it if you would share. So we want to get this message out there. We want to be of service. And so if it's something that you found valuable and it's something that you enjoyed, we would really appreciate you clicking the like button, commenting, and then most of all, sharing with your peeps. That would be awesome. Is there anything else that you want to add before we jump off of this recording?
Simply an encouragement to be with the courageous heart of being willing to take a step, and that's the key to make sure your exploration of shadow work is healthy and not self-destructive, is taking steps and making sure that you are staying with, because a lot of this is going to be exploring past trauma for most people. So making sure you're taking one step at a time and knowing that there's going to be time that you're going to need to take care of yourself afterwards, after an exploration or an embodiment practice. So really being in touch with and in tune with playing that edge of discomfort, but in a way, especially at the beginning, that's slower, instead of, okay, I'm going to take photos as my first practice.
Right. So I'm going to get all this shadow work done in a week. I'm going to take the week off of work. I'm going to get all this shit sorted out.
Right. Yes. Well, maybe, in that case, the overachiever is the shadow part of you to explore and, to put a collar on it and then
heal.
Tame the overachiever when it comes to shadow work.
And you mentioned earlier, and we kind of scooted over it, but this is super important too, and that's to find support. So we're not meant to take this journey alone. And that can look like a professional therapist or a coach or, a person in the clergy or a friend. It can look like anybody, but we're not meant to take this journey alone. So don't feel like you have to. Please, please, please get the support that you need.
Yes. Thank you so much, Julie.
You're so very welcome, Christelle. All right. We'll talk next time.